Welcome to Tool School. Today we're going to be talking about hand sewing needles. There's probably no sewing tool older than the hand sewing needle. Some of the oldest archaeological digs on Earth, you will find hand sewing needles of some form. Luckily for us today, we have some beautiful needles that have been created to us using modern technology. A couple of things we want to keep in mind when we're talking about hand sewing needles. First of all is the measurement system. It's exactly the opposite from sewing machine needles. Sewing machine needles, large numbers equal larger, heavier needle. In hand sewing needles, the larger number is a finer and a shorter needle. The other thing we want to keep in mind is they all have different names, but really you can use any needle for anything as long as it suits your purpose. The main thing you want to keep in mind is you should always use the finest shaft size and the sharpest point for the fabric that you're going to be using. So let's talk about some of the needles that we have. Now, as I mentioned to you, some needles have multiple applications. A good example is this one. This is the applique sharps. It's basically just a very thin shaft with a very sharp point with a medium length on it. This is a special needle. This is Clover's Black Gold. These needles are polished in a different direction than most standard needles. That makes it very smooth as you're trying to do your hand sewing, pulling the needle through your fabric. There's very little friction on that. The next needle we'll talk about is the quilting needles. Quilting needles, you do a lot of very precise small stitches. So the needle is very small. It's large enough to accommodate most quilting threads, and it's got a very sharp point for using high quality cotton fabrics. The next is our applique needle, which is similar to the quilting needle, but it's just longer. So it helps us when we're applying applique to our different projects. Another one after that is just the quilting needle, which is just the quilting between. And the difference between the quilting between and the quilting needle is the quilting betweens are usually much shorter. This is what you'd use for hand quilting, for doing all those decorative stitches on the top of a quilt. The next needle we have is our Gold Eye Chanel needle. Chanel needle has a very sharp point, but it has a very strong, thick shaft, as you can see, and a very long eye. And that allows us to put very heavy threads through these. The next one we have to talk about is the embroidery needle. This is basically a sharps, but it has a very elongated eye, so you can do a large diameter thread or perhaps even two threads for a special decorative look. And then we have just the sharps needle, and this is just the average needle most people would do for hand sewing repair work. It's just a general all-purpose needle, but it's got a thin shaft and a very sharp point. Then we have the Miller's needles, which is just a sharps needle, but it's very long for certain special projects. The Sashiko needle is very interesting. It has a very long eye for using the Sashiko threads, but has a very long shaft because the Sashiko technique requires that we push several stitches through the fabric at the same time. And of course, with all the new emphasis on bead looms, we have our beading needles, which are very fine, so you can pick up several beads at a time and then place them on your bead loom for bead weaving. And then we also have the self-threading needles, and these are needles designed specifically for folks who have trouble threading needles. You just, instead of threading through the eye, you just place the thread on the top and push it down into the needle, and you can sew with that. And that's the assortment of needles that Clover offers. Now that's a quick look at all the different needles. As I mentioned before, it's good to just get some, experiment with them, see which ones work for you and whatever technique that you happen to be working on. That's hand sewing needles. I'm Steve Butler, and that was Tool School.